Thanks for taking time out for the conversation that we had planned today at lunchtime. I see somebody took us up on the offer to bring your lunch with you, and that's good. This is a continuation of the Symposium on Democracy that began on Tuesday of this week, and we're very fortunate that we get to hear again now from Richard Carwardine. If you were at his lecture last evening, I think you'll agree with me that it was a profound and important lecture on topics that really do require the deep thought that he's given the subject. And so if you're not there, I encourage you to check out the video when it's available online. It'll be well worth your while. Today, the topic's a little bit lighter. We're going to be talking about Abraham Lincoln's humor. And hand me that newspaper there. I just wanted to note that on Lincoln's birthday, which was Tuesday of this week, on the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, you would find an article by Richard Carwardine. And the headline reads, "Lincoln wasn't handsome, but he had a great sense of humor," which sounds like a line that you might use when preparing someone for a blind date. I think it does, though, speak to the reputation that Richard enjoys really around the world as an authority on Abraham Lincoln. His books, The Global Lincoln, Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power, other books and articles that he's published on Lincoln over the years, and now the latest, Abraham Lincoln's Sense of Humor, have really positioned him as one of the leading authorities on one of our greatest and, frankly, I think one of our favorite presidents. And so, would you please join me in welcoming Richard Carwardine.
Well, thank you very much for turning out for this talk. When I was writing my book on Lincoln's humor, American friends understood the significance of the subject. But British friends would say, "Oh, Lincoln's sense of humor. Well, that would be a short book." Because they don't appreciate that Lincoln did have this profound sense of humor. What they think of is, they see is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, that stern marble figure. They know of Lincoln's great speeches. They see those photographs of Lincoln looking severe, as all Victorian subjects of photography had to be. But you'll know that Lincoln did have a sense of humor. Even so, American colleagues would say, well, yes, I understand why, but surely isn't this really rather a flippant subject? Where's the gravitas in Lincoln's humor? Surely there are bigger issues that you want to pursue. And the answer was, well, I see people as expressing themselves and revealing themselves rather more through their sense of when they're being funny than when they're being serious. You learn a lot about people when they are being funny, and certainly Lincoln was characteristically funny. His humor was as much part of him as his stovepipe hat, but unlike his hat, his humor was absolutely intrinsic to the man. I think his humor expressed his essential humanity, his sense of proportion, and his understanding of human foibles. What gave me the idea of writing about Lincoln's humor was by encountering Lincoln's response to a satire written by David Ross Locke, an Ohio journalist during the Civil War. Locke was a merciless satirist of the opposition Peace Democrats, the Copperheads. And he created a satirical grotesque called Petroleum v. Naseby. How many of you have heard of Petroleum v. Naseby? Well, that's it. Well, Naseby, let me tell you that Naseby was the pastor of this fictional pastor of a pro-slavery church, the Church of St. Vallandigham. Vallandigham, you would recall, was the kind of figurehead leader of the Peace Democrats during the Civil War. I don't know how many of you know that Vallandigham was a student at Jefferson College. His father was a Presbyterian. He had a Presbyterian clergyman, minister as his brother, and he himself was a pious Presbyterian. Anyway, so the Church of St. Vallandigham, which is presided over by the pastor, Petroleum v. Naseby, who was a racist, drunken, greedy, sordid, lying bigot. Locke, when asked about Petroleum v. Naseby, said, well, he was a sort of nickel-plated son of a bitch. And the V stood for Vesuvius. It was an indication that his bigoted and illiterate eruptions on the issues of the day were worth waiting for. And these eruptions would be syndicated right across the Union in a variety of pro-Union newspapers. Locke's use of the appalling Naseby to ridicule the disloyal opponents of the Lincoln administration delighted the president. The Naseby papers were published in a pamphlet. They were his constant companion. The pamphlet copy of the Naseby papers in the Library of Congress is marked by the burn marks, the singe marks of the candle that he was using to read them by at night. He could quote vast sections of the Naseby papers at will. He learned them. He had a fine mind, a quick mind. And on the final afternoon of Lincoln's life, on the 14th of April of 1865, he delayed dinner by reading aloud from the Naseby papers to two Illinois visiting friends. And he said to Locke, for the genius to write these things, I would gladly give up my office. It was a measure of how much Lincoln admired the savagery, the satirical savagery of Locke's assault on racial prejudice and on the anti-emancipation sentiment that Locke was exposing in this satire. Satire is value-laden. Lincoln admired the great ethical force of Locke's satire. So Locke and Lincoln were my starting point. But the resulting book went beyond that, of course. I was aiming to look at four things, or at least to pursue four themes. One was to look at the range and sources of Lincoln's humour. Where did it come from? What kind of humour did he particularly like? Secondly, to chart, I should say, how it evolved over the course of Lincoln's life. Thirdly, to examine the varied purposes behind his use of comic stories and jokes. And finally, to consider the political damage as well as benefits that follows from being known as a humorist, particularly a humorist in time of a bloody civil war. Just a few words then about the range and sources. Lincoln learned storytelling from his father, Thomas Lincoln, who was a great storyteller. But he also read and owned joke books, in particular Joe Miller's Jests, an 18th century British joke book first published in the 1730s, but went through many, many editions and circulated widely in the United States as well as, of course, in England. He also had a formidable memory. Lincoln had a capacity to hold on to any stories, anecdotes, jokes that he was told and just lodge them away in his brain for later deployment. And he relished pretty well every form of the comic. On the one hand, he loved tall tales of absurdity, but equally he enjoyed wordplay and delight in the plasticity of language. And then in between, all kinds of quick wit, irony, logical fallacy, and satire, as I just mentioned, and notoriously, perhaps above all, dirty jokes and stories. It's true. I'll come on to that. I'll give you an example. If you'll tolerate it. Now, like many successful satirists, humorists, Lincoln knew how to win over an audience by self-mockery. He would take a joke at his own expense. It gave him lots of opportunities to play the victim. There was the story that as he was splitting rails, he found himself looking down the gun barrel of a passerby who explained that he had promised to shoot the first man he met who was uglier than himself. Getting a good look at the man's face, Lincoln apparently remarked while baring his chest, "Well, if I am uglier than you, then blaze away." And Lincoln loved tall tales. According to Noah Brooks, he thought that the chief characteristic of American humor was its grotesqueness and extravagance. Russell Conwell wrote of being with Lincoln when a self-important man entered the room, whispered in the president's ear, and then left. And with a smile, Lincoln explained, "Oh, he tells me that 12,000 of Lee's soldiers have been captured, but that doesn't mean anything. He's the biggest liar in Washington. You can't believe a word he says. It reminds me of an old fisherman I used to know who got such a reputation for stretching the truth that he bought a pair of scales and insisted on weighing every fish in the presence of witnesses. One day a baby was born next door and the doctor borrowed the fisherman's scales to weigh the baby. It weighed 47 pounds. There's no surprise then that Lincoln celebrated for his craftsmanship in language. He should have loved the humorous possibilities of English. He took delight in puns. Caught on one occasion a lawyer who claimed that he could bring a man to prove an alibi. Heard Lincoln shooting back, "I have no doubt you can bring a man to prove a lie-by." And then there was Lincoln's response to this particular episode when during a breaking of trial, Hill Lamon ripped the seat of his pants and reappeared in the courthouse with the damage unrepaired. A fellow attorney jocularly called on his colleagues to pledge donations for a new pair of pants, but when the subscription sheet reached Lincoln, he simply wrote, "I can contribute nothing to the end in view." And as I mentioned earlier that he took delight in logic, in fallacious logic. As a self-taught Euclidean, this perhaps is no surprise. He relished the story of John Moore, an Illinois state treasurer, who was returning home one night inebriated in a cart drawn by a fine pair of red steers. As they passed through a grove, one of the cart's wheels struck a stump and threw the pole out of the ring of the yoke. The freed steers ran away, leaving Moore sound asleep. Early in the morning, he roused himself and looking over the side of the cart and around in the woods, he said, "If my name is John Moore, I've lost a pair of steers. If my name ain't John Moore, I've found the cart." Sharp wit was not Lincoln's prevailing, almost a representative mode of humour, but he's alleged to have said, "Wit laughs at everybody, humour laughs with everybody." But he did have a capacity for devastatingly quick wit and trenchant repartee. When it was observed that Attorney General Edward Bates had black hair but a white beard, Lincoln thought it could hardly be otherwise. He uses his jaws more than he does his brains. And James Wilson, the Union officer, recalled the president's story of the Southern Illinois preacher who noted in his sermon that the scriptures told of only one perfect man, Jesus Christ, having lived on earth, and that they offered no record of a perfect woman. This prompted the intervention of a forlorn voice at the back of the church. "I know a perfect woman, and I've heard of her about every day for the last 6 years." "Who was she?" the minister asked. "My husband's first wife." Lincoln enjoyed gentle wit, dry, ironic gentle wit. He included the case of the farmer who protested, "I ain't greedy about land. I only just want what joins my own." And he used this gentle formula more than once when acceding to a request for a job. "The lady," he wrote, "bearer of this says that she has 2 sons who want to work. Set them at it if possible. Wanting to work is so rare a merit that it should be encouraged." Lincoln had very little time for the theological contention between Protestant denominations. Whether or not salvation was attainable by all was a question that divided Christians. Lincoln relished a tale of his early days in Springfield, when religious life centered around the Baptist, the Methodist, and the Presbyterian churches. When a clever young universalist preacher appeared with the aim of establishing a church of his own, the settled ministers agreed to preach the intruder down. The Presbyterian went first into battle. He reminded his hearers how happily they were getting along in Springfield, spiritually and otherwise. Now, he said, there comes among us a stranger to establish a church on the belief that all men are to be saved. But my brethren, let us hope for better things. Many, perhaps most of Lincoln's stories were, as Quintus put it, were not exactly proper for the drawing room. Family, friends and colleagues agreed that, of course, the vulgar and earthly stories were the mainstay of his humour. When Lincoln was asked, why do you not write about your stories? Why do you write them down and put them in a book? Lincoln apparently drew himself up, fixed his face as if 1,000 dead carcasses were shooting all their stench into his nostrils, and said, such a book would stink like 1,000 privies. Colleagues emphasized that it was not the crudity that Lincoln loved so much as the story's pertinence and wit. And that, I think, was probably true. And I think we should remember that Lincoln's immodest stories were more offensive to Victorian sensibilities than to our own. I think this is probably the case of the story that he told to John Palmer Usher. A collector of relics heard about an old lady with a dress that she had worn during the Revolutionary War. He visited the lady and asked her if she would produce the dress to satisfy his love of aged things. She did so, and he enthusiastically held it up, saying, were you the dress that this lady, once young and blooming, wore in the time of Washington? No doubt when she came home from the dressmaker, she kissed you as I do now. As he did so heartily, the unimpressed owner remarked, stranger, if you want to kiss something old, you'd better kiss my ass. It's 16 years older than that dress. Let's say something about how Lincoln's humor evolved. I've only given you a few examples here of the many different stories that he told, but how did it evolve? And I haven't time to go into the detail that I do in the book. But what strikes me is that over the course of Lincoln's career, he moved away from using humor that could hurt, that could wound, to a more gentle form of humor. As an aspiring young politician, he did resort to cruel humor at times, not just to put his opponents on the defensive, but to crush and humiliate them. And there were two experiences in particular that taught him a painful lesson that self-indulgent humor could injure its author as well as its target. The first of these was during his campaign for the legislature in 1840, when he responded to a stinging speech from Judge Jesse Thomas with an even more withering reply. And for the first time in public, he resorted to mimicry. Now, Lincoln was a brilliant mimic. He could mimic voice and he could mimic manner. And to the yells and cheers of the crowd, he imitated Judge Thomas's voice, and he caricatured his walk and the very motion of his body, with the result that the victim, Judge Thomas, broke down and I quote, began to blubber like a baby. The skinning of Thomas, as the event was known, was so unlike Lincoln that both friends and enemies recorded for years afterwards. Lincoln himself confessed to Billy Herndon, his law partner, that he'd gone too far, and the memory, he said, filled him with the deepest chagrin. But the second episode in September of 1842 would teach him the value of self-censorship and satirical restraint. It was prompted by his witty, pseudonymous ridicule of the state auditor, 36-year-old James Shields, Democrat, in the pages of the Sangamon Journal. James Shields, was an impetuous man on a short fuse, and he had good reason to rage at the insult of the pages of the journal, with its sexual insinuations and demeaning assault on his character, and he challenged Lincoln to a duel, which Lincoln reluctantly accepted. We can't be sure how far Lincoln intended the dark humor that lurked in his selection of weapons. Cavalry broadswords of the largest size, precisely equal in all respects. 8 inches taller than shields, Lincoln would have a huge advantage in reach. On his way to the dueling ground, which was not in Illinois, which prohibited by statute dueling, the dueling ground was on an island in the Mississippi River under part of Missouri. But on the way to the dueling ground, hundreds of people turned out to watch. Lincoln said he was reminded, as he made his way to the ground, of the young Kentuckian whose sweetheart, as he was leaving home to fight in 1812, presented him with a belt embroidered with the motto, "Victory or Death." Isn't that rather too strong? The grateful volunteer said, "Suppose you put victory or be crippled." Only at the last moment was the duel averted. Never again would Lincoln write insulting, anonymous, or pseudonymous satire. He recognized that when taken to an offensive extreme, ridicule could damage its acknowledged author as well as its victim. Lincoln's sense of humor was so frequently deployed that it naturally prompts the question, what was its purpose? Lincoln, would repeat with glee the description of a type of Southwestern political orator who, and I quote, mounted the rostrum, threw back his head, shined his eyes, opened his mouth, and left the consequences to God. In contrast, Lincoln's humor and stories were carefully weighed and contrived. They were a means of empowerment, a means of imposing himself on others. He relished the role of entertainer and was invigorated by it. He wasn't an easy mover. He didn't have the kind of ease of movement that you associate with a great actor. But he had a gift for squeezing the most humor out of his material and delivering a punchline. And he dominated the gatherings where he told stories. Secondly, I think humor undoubtedly acted as a health-giving salve. His appetite for humor and his notorious vulnerability to depression were two sides of the same coin. Laughter was a therapeutic antidote to the grievous low spirits to which he was prone. Lincoln explained, if it were not for these stories, these jokes, these jests, I should die. They are the vents to my moods and gloom. And in his face-to-face engagement with the public, Lincoln's recourse to stories and jokes were designed to remind his hearers of his lowly origins. It encouraged common people to see him as a natural man, lacking artifice, able to engage on equal terms with ordinary farmers and laborers. His habit of self-deprecation helped to enlist an audience on the side of the underdog. Throughout his political wrestling with Stephen Douglas in Illinois in the 1850s, he regularly assumed the identity of the modest provincial facing the worldwide renown of the Democrats' prime hope for the presidency, the White House, who enjoyed the status, as Lincoln put it, of a very great man, while he, Lincoln, was only a small man. Of course, a heavily ironic use of language here, intensified by the sight of the diminutive little giant standing next to the elongated Lincoln. Lincoln also used laughter to lodge a self-serving idea. As a lawyer, he wielded humor to plant a seed that would shape the deliberations of a jury. During a lunch break, he is said to have told jurors the story of a small boy who ran to summon his father. "Pa, come quick!" And the boy panted, "The hired man and sis are up in the haymow, and he's a-pulling down his pants, and she's a-lifting up her skirts, and Pa, they're getting ready to pee all over our hay." The father replied, "Son, you've got your facts absolutely right, but you've drawn a completely wrong conclusion." Later in court, following his opponent's lengthy winding-up speech, Lincoln told the jurors, "My learned opponent has his facts absolutely right, but he's drawn completely the wrong conclusion," and he won the case. Humor also provides a means of diversion. He used anecdotes to turn or smooth a conversation without giving offense. John Hay told how in late 1863, an infernal nuisance of a Brooklyn postmaster with his eyes on the following year's presidential election, fastened himself to the tycoon, the president, and tried to get into conversation on the subject of the succession of the next president. Lincoln quickly put him off with the story of his friend Jesse Du Bois, who as state auditor controlled the use of the Illinois State House in Springfield. An itinerant quack preacher requested the use of the State House for a religious lecture. "What's it about?" said Jesse Du Bois. "Ah, the second coming of Christ," said the parson. "Nonsense," roared Uncle Jesse. "If Christ had been to Springfield once and gone away, he'd be damn clear of coming again." And I think Lincoln's stories, above all else, served a colourful means of instruction and elucidation. They gave him the means of driving home political arguments with engaging economy. Finding himself with the support of only one cabinet member during a critical phase of the Trent Affair, when Britain threatened war over the Union Navy's seizure of Confederate envoys from a British ship, he recalled the drunk who strayed into an Illinois church and fell asleep in the front pew. He slumbered on as the revivalist asked, "Who are on the Lord's side?" The congregation responded by rising en masse. When the preacher then inquired, "And who are on the side of the devil?" the sleeper stirred, but not fully grasping the inquiry and seeing the minister on his feet, he stood up. "I don't exactly understand the question," he said, "but I'll stand by you, parson, to the last. It seems to me that we're in a hopeless minority." What were the political consequences of all of this? During his presidency, Lincoln's supporters seized on Lincoln's reputation as a humorist, on his studied use of humor, to show how an occupant of the White House could remain a genial man of the people. As he faced up to the ordeal of wartime office, his supporters wove his inveterate habit of telling ludicrous stories into a larger appreciation of his moral character. Pro-administration newspapers regularly drew attention to the president's latest story. Lincoln's private secretary, John Hay, cultivated a warm relationship with several journalists and supplied them with examples of the president's wit. Commercial interests exploited this benign reading of Lincoln's humor in compiling jokes and stories and publishing them as stories originating with the president. They weren't. These were usually stories that had nothing to do with Lincoln, but they were trading on this president's reputation as a genial joker. In setting out the moral value of Lincoln's storytelling, his supporters were really seeking to counter his opponents' disdain for a president whose tasty jokes they declared made him unfit for his position. Both Confederates and critics in the Union seized on Lincoln's humor as a stick with which to beat him. Their common charge was that his appetite for low jokes revealed a lack of gravitas, that he used humor to mask his deficiencies. His jokes measured his cruel disregard for the victims of war. Lincoln, the heartless buffoon, became a recurring theme. And Democrats insinuated a critique of Lincoln, the Joker, into each of their key campaigning themes in 1864. And none was more challenging than the charge of Lincoln's shocking levity in the face of numbing military slaughter. The opposition's theme of Lincoln, the Widowmaker, who lays the nation across his knee and tickles her catastrophe with obscene jokes and little stories, became a campaign staple. And nothing gave the attack greater power than the bogus accusation that when visiting the blood-drenched Antietam battlefield in October 1862, Lincoln had shattered its sanctity by asking to hear a vulgar comic song while touring the field, with the bodies yet warm in their graves. Accompanied by Hill Lamon, General George McClellan, and another officer, Lincoln drove over the field as heavy details of men were burying the dead. Lincoln suddenly slapping Marshal Lemon upon the knee, exclaimed, "Come, Lemon, give us that song about Picayune Butler. McClellan has never heard it." With a shudder, the general protested, "Not now, if you please, Marshal. I would prefer to hear it some other place, time." Now, it's impossible to determine precisely how Lincoln's reputation as a joker shaped the political balance in the presidential election of 1864. That the administration's supporters included many who found the president's levity distasteful indicates that, for them at least, the matter was not decisive. But his opponents clearly believed it offered great electoral opportunity. And Lincoln, too, well understood how a reputation for levity could expose him to misrepresentation and electoral damage. It was only after very careful reflection that he opted not to respond publicly to the bogus Antietam story. In time after his death, Lincoln's reputation as the peerless presidential story spinner, joke teller, and ready wit would come to take on a character wholly positive and benign. But that was not the reality during the dark and deadly days of war. So, to conclude, my case is that Lincoln's sense of humor has to be taken seriously. It was an essential element of his thought and practice, both as a man and as a president. We should recognize its rich variety and its complexity of purpose, understand its ethical dimension, and remain aware of the political risks that Lincoln ran in retailing jokes while the nation, a republic of suffering, was engaged in an existential struggle costing at least 750,000 lives. As the nation suffered, so of course did the president. Humor was his lifeline. As the war drew to a close, he told a friend, "Die when I may, I want it said of me by those who know me best that I always plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought a flower would grow." In this strenuous nurturing of the Republic, he drew on his strategic wisdom, on his clarity of principle, skill in political management and communication, grasp of human psychology, and physical and mental strength. And to these ingredients, I believe we should add his remarkable and celebrated sense of humor. His ability to see the absurd side of life was a measure of his well-developed humanity. It gave him the sense of proportion that all presidents need if they are to elevate their office into the realm of statesmanship. But I ask you to ponder, in closing, the question, is it possible to be a great statesman without a sense of the ludicrous and of the foibles and weaknesses of humankind? That's my question, and I'm now happy to take your questions if you'd like to respond to what I said.
You mentioned Lincoln's depression, and that's why his pension of carrying the job. How much truth about his depression is over exaggerated in the literature?
This is a question about how far, is that Karen?
Yes.
It's a question about how seriously depressed Lincoln was. Depression was something that he carried with him throughout his life. The most intense bouts of depression occurred when he was a younger man, in the 1830s and 1840s. There was a point in the very early 1840s where his friends thought he was so depressed that he might take his own life. He never reached that stage of that depth of depression subsequently. And of course, much of the stress that would lead anyone to be depressed came during the Civil War. Not just a sense of huge responsibility for a war that was consuming so many lives, but the depression that came from the death of the dearly beloved Willie in February of 1862. within the first year of the war, after which he no longer had a wife to lean on emotionally. I mean, Mary was even more badly damaged by the death of Willie than was Abraham himself. He had a job to keep him active and engaged. He knew that, I'll just say as an aside here, Lincoln knew and appreciated the writings of Sidney Smith, the British clergyman, British clergyman, the Serbian British Anglican minister of the same era. He read Sidney Smith and appreciated Sidney Smith. And Sidney Smith had a prescription for what you do, who was himself a depressive, and he was a prescription of what you do to cope with depression. And one of the antidotes to depression was to keep busy, to set yourself small, doable tasks. Well, recovering the Union was not a small, doable task. That was a huge task, and the question was it really doable? But there were lots of ways of keeping yourself occupied and focused in ways that were manageable. And that's what Lincoln did. Lincoln once said to a student who asked him what the secret was of becoming a successful lawyer, he said, work, work, work is the main thing. And that's what Lincoln did. And on the day after his election in re-election in 1864, someone in the guard of the White House could hear some activity, and he went to investigate, and he found it was Lincoln. It was very, very early. It was just dawn, and Lincoln was already at work at his desk. So Lincoln turned to work as a means of contending with the tendency towards depression and the understandable grief that he felt after the death of Willie. And as I say, he no longer had a wife that he could turn to for that emotional support. I think probably got his emotional support much more from his young, particularly his young secretary John Hayne, who he treated as a sort of son, actually. But the depression was very real. As I say, I know that he had read Sidney Smith. He once, Smith was very funny and also very depressive, and Smith was, Lincoln once said to a cabinet member that it would take a surgical operation to get a joke into his head, probably referring to Sam Chase. But that expression, using the tip of a surgical operation, he took directly and actually unacknowledged from Sidney Smith. So I know that he was utterly sympathetic to fellow depressives. There's a very, very good book by Joshua Schenck called Lincoln's Melancholy, published about 12 years ago. Schenck himself was a fellow depressive. It's a very well researched and compelling book. And I like to think that if my book on Lincoln's humour could be as good in respect of Lincoln's humour as his is in terms of Lincoln's melancholy, then they'd make a very fine pairing of books.
How do you make the difference of British humor versus American humor is played by Lincoln? That's one question. The second question is, what else? Lincoln was essentially self-taught. He didn't have much of an education growing up, but what books did he read other than, you mentioned a couple? What sort of, did you get any feeling of what he read in the magazines?
So, two questions there. The first one about how as a Brit, I see any differences between the kind of things that Lincoln actually was what we Brits would like. I would say that the real difference is not between what the British and the Americans found in this, because as I suggested, one of the most widely circulating joke books in the United States in the early Republic was Joe Miller's Jest, and this was a British joke book, so there was a common pool of at least some degree of commonality in the humour that was deployed. I think the real contrast is not between Britain and America, but between then and now. I mean, mostly humour is locked in time and place, much is locked in time and place. There's nothing so unfunny that for me than to look at Punch cartoons of the 19th century, which seem no longer to have any kind of humour to them. And they only made sense in that particular time, that particular moment in politics or in social evolution. What strikes me is just how, and I could tell from at least some of the laughter that was coming back and the smiles, that what strikes you too is that actually how Lincoln's humour does travel. Much of it does travel. Sometimes it's the sharp wit that you can still see. You can see what he's getting at. Naisby's the satire of David Ross Locke takes a little bit more coming to terms with it. It's very much on its time and place. But on the whole, Lincoln's humour, I think, does travel and travels remarkably well. There's one, I mean, you occasionally get a bit dumbfounded by the degree of laughter that Lincoln generates with a remark. I mean, there's a familiar tale that during the 1864, the build-up to the 1864 election, more particularly to do with the build-up to the Republican Union Party nominating convention of May-June that year. There was a move to remove Lincoln and to replace him with another candidate. And Lincoln alluded to the story of the Dutch farmer who had said that it was not a good idea to change horses while you were in midstream. Well, it's a sort of mildly colourful image there. It's hard to see that it would necessarily produce the sort of tears streaming down the face kind of laughter that apparently it generated at the time. So some of the material doesn't travel so well, but on the whole it's surprising how much does. Your second question, which was to do with the books you read, yeah. Well, of course, you read very seriously as well as humorously. And there's a very nice book by Robert Bray called Lincoln's Reading. And you can't always be sure precisely what he read. He took books out of the Library of Congress. We've got the register of books that he was reading while president, or at least he was borrowing while president. But whether he was reading them for himself or whether they were being read by others, whether he actually managed to read what he took out of the library. We know that he had access before the presidency to William Herndon's very extensive library, his law partner. But again, precisely which of those books he read, hard to say. We know he read James Smith's, the Presbyterian minister in Springfield, wrote a very powerful 500-page Christian's Defense, a defense of Christianity, which he lent to Lincoln, and Lincoln claims to have read. So he was reading theology, he was reading in science. Of course, he, as a self-taught surveyor and lawyer, he read in law. The humour that he read, beyond Joe Miller, Quinn's Jests, we think, were another British jest book which circulated. He loved James Baldwin's Flush Times in Alabama, and some of the stories there. He loved the story of K.F. Burton, who was so enamored with the truth that he would never stop embroidering it. He loved those kind of tall tales of the Southwest. And as I say, quite a lot of the humour came not from reading, but actually from the conversation with fellow lawyers and others on the circuit, or fellow politicians, particularly when he was in the Illinois State House. So a mixture of reading, as far as the humour is concerned, a mixture of reading and conversation, the capacity to hold on to material. As he said, once something was etched in his brain, it was like as though it had been written there, like on a metal plate, scratched in metal. He never forgot it. And what's impressive is the capacity, not only is the fact that he not only never forgot it, but he could retrieve it so quickly and personally in given situations. Jennifer.
Thanks for bringing this aspect of Lincoln's character to light, since I think it is a part of his character that's largely forgotten. And I just wondered if you could compare Lincoln to other presidents American presidents who have either known for being funny, or maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum are known for not being able to take a joke. And if you do think this is an important part of, what made him a great leader, how does that then translate to other leaders that we've had?
Well, we were having this little chat over lunch before we came here, and I think there are other just ferociously funny presidents. I mean intentionally ferociously funny presidents, of whom Ronald Reagan would be an obvious example. Reagan has been sort of likened as a vaudevillian turd. The capacity that he had to tell a story and to deliver a punchline, the actor's training. My own view is that unlike Lincoln, whose stories were almost always pertinent to a particular situation, Reagan just loved to laugh for its own sake, so sometimes he would go into a riff of jokes which didn't really have any bearing on the matter in hand. But he undoubtedly was a very funny man, and I think generated a lot of warmth towards him through that. I think Bill Clinton, we were talking about this earlier, Bill Clinton had a sense of humour. John Kennedy certainly was a very witty man. He tended, I think, to be wittier and funnier in private than he was in public. He could be very funny in press conferences, but he held back because he didn't want to be seen to be unserious. I think there's always the danger for a politician. If you go too far in the direction of comedy and humour, you are seen to be lightweight, not inadequately serious, as it were. I think there was a lightness of touch to FDR. Certainly a man who did understand humour and could deploy it. But surprisingly, Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, he wasn't so totally silent that he couldn't deliver a very dry quip. He's perhaps the surprising figure in 20th century humorous presidents. In the 19th century, or in the early years of the Republic, I think you have to say that Lincoln was the first president who used humour as a weapon. I'm not suggesting that previous presidents didn't have a sense of humour, but I suspect that it was in no case was that sense of humour as well developed as it was with Lincoln. And I struggled in the 19th century to find anyone who comes close to the quality of humour that we find in Lincoln or in the 20th century presidents I mentioned. If you want to take this further, you might want to look at a website, the DC Improv website, based in one of the comedy stores in Washington. I did an interview for them last year on Lincoln's sense of humour. It was the last in a series of podcasts on 44 presidents, one podcast per president. And the person who organised this was himself a stand-up comedian, but with a passionate interest in, for his wife, a passionate interest in American history and American presidential history. And he got a whole range of historians and commentators and political scientists and indeed comics to comment on every previous president. Some I think are more reliable in their analysis than others. Chris himself came to he did a podcast assessing all 44 and then concluding who was the funniest, and he reduced it to a short list of Lincoln and Reagan, and gave the nod to Reagan. But he said it's probably because he was a comic himself, but he just so appreciated the way that he had recordings of Reagan. There are no recordings of Lincoln. So does that answer your question?
We have time for one more question.
We have another one down here. It's insatiable.
I know you are the Lincoln scholar, and I know this one Prime Minister is a great admirer of Lincoln. How about our founding father, Washington, Jefferson, or Adams? In a way, they are the traitors of rebellion as far as you guys are concerned. Do they command the same respect as Lincoln does among you guys?
Yes, do the founding fathers command respect on the other side of the Atlantic? I think we've now put all that behind us. Now, I think your question is, of course, a serious one. How do people in Britain view Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Madison? I have to say, if you were to take out a microphone into the streets of London and thrust the microphone into the face of any passerby, they'd look at you blankly when you mention these names. They would probably recognize Washington. They might recognize Jefferson, but they probably wouldn't have a view on either. But if you ask the educated Brits about them, then of course they're full of admiration for this wonderful generation, this genius generation. The people who organized, who led the revolution and put in place the new government. Initially through the state constitutions with the Confederation, Articles of Confederation, but then subsequently, more importantly, through the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, and who steered the country into a republic. These enlightened geniuses, this generation of brilliance, is worthy of huge respect. I mean, if only we had these generations of geniuses all the time in our political life, but we don't. There are these moments when things come together. So I think enormous respect for that founding generation, and the warmth that once was not there between our two countries, I think by the early 20th century developed into something really very considerable. Perhaps I end by saying, Lincoln, I said that Lincoln's sense of humor is not well known in the UK, but there was a point in the early 20th century after the centenary of Lincoln's birth and the Great War, when Lincoln was revered. There was a cult of Lincoln. George Bernard Shaw said there is a cult of Lincoln, a great appreciation for Lincoln's democratic values, his being a representative of a kind of society in which, regardless of the class into which you were born, you could make your own way through your own abilities and through your own qualities. And that made Lincoln deeply admired by progressives and radicals across Europe, actually, but particularly in Britain.
All right, well, thank you, Richard, and let's give him a hand.